In class, we talked about the insulin and glucagon as an example of negative feedback. Now, what we're going to talk about in this video is a little bit different because now we're including the brain. So you can see in the title alone how it says neuroendocrine pathways. So here, we're going to actually see how we can connect the nervous system with the endocrine system. So here we are still talking about hormone pathways that respond to stimuli from the external environment that rely from a sensor in the nervous system. But we could also have an internal environment. But anyway, so here in vertebrates, the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that's going to connect the endocrine and nervous systems. So here you can see the hypothalamus, and right below it you have your pituitary gland. Now the pituitary gland is like the master gland in us. And so when we look at this, signals from the hypothalamus travel to the pituitary, and that's what we're going to study in this video. Okay, so here you have the hypothalamus, and right below it we have two parts of the pituitary. There's the anterior pituitary as well as the posterior pituitary. Now first, we're going to focus on only the anterior pituitary. So here we have these special neurons called neurosecretory cells. You can see in this word here, like it's going to secrete something. So this specialized neuron actually makes, well, there's some blood vessels because hormones travel in the blood. So here, though, this neurosecretory cell actually secretes specialized hormones called neurohormones. Now, they're called neurohormones because they're technically made in the brain and not in an endocrine gland. But we do know that hormones travel in the blood. So while these neurohormones are only traveling to the anterior pituitary, they still travel there in the blood. So the neurohormones travel in blood vessels a very short distance to the anterior pituitary. But when they get there, remember, hormones have their target cells. So the target cells for these neurohormones are located within the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary, their target cells will receive the neurohormones, and then they're going to respond, right? So when that ligand attaches to these target cells, now you're going to have a cellular response. And as luck would have it, the anterior pituitary, these cells, their cell response is to make new hormones. So these hormones will actually travel in the body, travel in the blood to the rest of the body. So here you have anterior pituitary hormones. So to summarize, the hypothalamus has neurosecretory cells that release neurohormones, and they travel in the bloodstream to their target cells located within the anterior pituitary. In response to these neurohormones, the anterior pituitary makes its own hormones that are released into the body. So we're going to go ahead and look at a couple examples of anterior pituitary hormones. So here you have the hypothalamus releases a neurohormone. It targets the anterior pituitary. In response, the anterior pituitary releases its own hormone that targets the thyroid gland. So the thyroid is a gland that releases hormones. So when these blue diamonds attach or travel to the thyroid gland's response is to then release thyroxine. So thyroxine is the hormone that comes from the thyroid, and it regulates metabolism throughout your body. So if we see here, let's go ahead and define and name these different hormones. So this pink triangle is called TSH releasing hormone, TRH. Then you have TSH, thyroid releasing hormone. So let's just think about these names for a minute. This one called TRH is thyroid or TSH releasing hormone. What it does is in its name, it tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH. And then you have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Oh, shoot. This should say stimulating, sorry. Thyroid stimulating hormone. And what that's going to do is it's going to stimulate the thyroid to release thyroxine. All right. So again, Let's see how this works. So the hypothalamus releases TRH, which travels to the anterior pituitary and tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH. TSH stimulates the thyroid. That's its name, thyroid stimulating hormone. And that thyroid produces thyroxine. But over time, if you get more and more thyroxine, you want to have a way to turn off this pathway or at least slow it down. So what happens is when when thyroxine levels get so high, it actually feeds back and inhibits the hypothalamus from releasing TRH. So the hypothalamus will actually slow its release of TRH, which then in turn slows and lowers the amount of TSH, and then the thyroid hormone gets used up within the body and its numbers lower. However, if it drops too low, if thyroxine levels drop too low, we can also feed back and tell the hypothalamus, hey, our numbers are too low, we're below set point, we need to increase thyroxine. So in that case, it feeds back. The hypothalamus increases its TRH, which then the anterior pituitary releases TSH, which travels to the thyroid, and that increases its thyroxine. Now, as cool as this is, there's one more part. The thyroxine actually also feeds back and can inhibit or direct the anterior pituitary as well. So the thyroxine levels also influence anterior pituitary. If the thyroxine levels are too low, the anterior pituitary will increase the amount of TSH. If the thyroxine levels are high, then the anterior pituitary will decrease the amount of TSH that it makes. So when we look at the neuroendocrine pathway regulating our thyroid hormone, we can see that the amount of thyroxine actually influences both the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus in regulating how much of their hormones they make, because ultimately the final response is going to be thyroxine. Okay, so let's go ahead and see another example of a neuroendocrine pathway. So we have another hormone from our hypothalamus called gonadotropin releasing hormone. And so we have LH and FSH. And then we have testosterone. So when we talk about our hypothalamus, it releases GnRH, where its target cells are the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary in response releases FSH and LH and travel through the bloodstream. Its target is the testes. And in response, the testes will produce testosterone. Now, testosterone will travel through the body to its target cells. And then over time, the testosterone levels will decrease. And so the hypothalamus will sense that and in response release gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, which then triggers the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, and then that targets the testes, and in response the testes secretes more testosterone. So here you see multiple hormones working to keep the level of testosterone in balance. So again, this is a negative feedback loop. The amount of testosterone works both on the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. Now this is the same for females with our ovaries. We also have gonadotropin releasing hormone, LH and FSH, except for now when LH and FSH target the ovaries response is to release estrogen or progesterone depending on the time of her cycle. And so then the estrogen travels. So same exact way with the gonadotropin and LH and FSH as far as negative feedback is concerned. Now for females, we'll talk more in class. Their levels of estrogen does cycle throughout the month as well as her other hormone, progesterone. And so we'll look at that in class in a little bit more detail. Now, these are a few examples of hormones from the anterior pituitary. There are a few more that we will discuss in class, but this is the basic form of how it works. Now we're going to focus at, negative feedback to keep things in balance. Okay, so now we're going to focus on the posterior pituitary. Now, the posterior pituitary is a little bit different with how it's connected to the hypothalamus. So with the posterior pituitary, the neurohormone is actually travels and actually connects all the way into the posterior pituitary. And so this is different because in the anterior pituitary, the neurohormone stopped here, and then blood had to carry the hormones down to the anterior. In this situation, the neurosecretory cell goes all the way to and into the anterior pituitary. Now this is because when the goes all the way through into the posterior pituitary. Now this is because when the brain was forming and the pituitary gland was forming, the posterior pituitary actually formed as an extension of the hypothalamus. So that's why this neurosecretory cell actually goes all the way into the posterior pituitary. Now the posterior pituitary doesn't actually make any hormones. All it does is really store and release hormones made by the hypothalamus. So the first hormone we're going to look at is oxytocin. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone, the love hormone. That's why I have it as a heart. But the hypothalamus is the one that makes the oxytocin, and it travels through the neurosecretory cell, or it's released from the neurosecretory cell, and is stored in the posterior pituitary until it's released into the bloodstream. So it's stored in the posterior pituitary and then released into the bloodstream. So let's go ahead and see an example of when the body would use oxytocin. So when a mother is breastfeeding and the baby attaches onto the nipple, there's going to be sensory neurons, kind of an ugly neuron, but sensory neurons that send that message to the brain. This is the stimulus. Now that will activate the hypothalamus's neurosecretory cells to create and release oxytocin. The oxytocin will then travel to the mammary glands, which will then, the response will be to produce milk. So that's an example of oxytocin in the body. Now the other hormone that the hypothalamus makes is ADH, Antidiuretic Hormone. Now, this hormone, antidiuretic. Diuretic means to urinate or go pee. So if you have anti-urinate, that means anti-pee hormone. So this hormone is involved in regulating your blood osmolarity. If we look at our bloodstream and how many solutes are in our blood, remember we try to stay isotonic. And so this hormone is what regulates how often you go to the bathroom, how often you pee. It's going to monitor your water levels. So for example, if a person becomes dehydrated for whatever reason, their blood osmolarity is increasing. It's becoming hypertonic. They're having too many solutes, and there's not enough water to balance it in an isotonic situation. So there are receptors in the hypothalamus, osmoreceptors, that detect your blood osmolarity. And now the hypothalamus, in response, is going to say, wow, we need to conserve our water. Our blood is not isotonic. We cannot afford to urinate and waste water. So the hypothalamus will actually produce ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and then it will release into the bloodstream from the posterior pituitary, targeting your kidneys. It'll change how your kidneys absorb water, and it will conserve water so you don't waste it in your pee. Now, on the opposite, if a person is overhydrated and their blood is becoming hypotonic and there's too much water, would the hypothalamus make ADH? No. Instead, it's going to lower or stop production of ADH because we do need to get that excess water out. And so the amount of ADH will change, and the kidneys will filter the blood, making urine, and get that excess water out. So again, ADH is used to balance our blood osmolarity, and it's our hypothalamus that has osmoreceptors in the brain that are going to detect this and then regulate the amounts of ADH that is released from the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the posterior pituitary, before I end the video, only makes ADH and oxytocin. So, not the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary only releases ADH and oxytocin, but those are the only two that the hypothalamus makes, and releases into the bloodstream through the posterior pituitary.